everybody, and welcome to Chapter 13. This is the immune system. Looking at the outline, we'll talk about the body's defense system. We'll talk about 3 lines of defense, distinguishing self from non-self, antibody-mediated responses versus cell-mediated responses, adaptive immune response, active and passive immunity, monoclonal antibodies, and problems or diseases of the immune system. So, when our body encounters something that we haven't seen before, these include pathogens or they include cancer cells. And so pathogens, these include the families of bacterias, viruses, prions. Prions is like what causes mad cow disease, protozoans, fungi, and parasites. Cancer cells, these are once part of our normal cells that have just gone bad, basically uncontrolled cell division, going to areas where they don't belong. So there's 3 lines of defense, and the first line of defense is going to be your physical and chemical surface barriers. So this is like the skin. All right, the skin, the chemicals that come from the skin, like oil and sweat. It is non-specific, meaning anybody that looks bad, it fights against. And so this is kind of like the fence that's around your house there. And so it tries to keep foreign organisms out of your internal body. So this would be like your mucous membranes from mouth to anus, your respiratory linings, and then the outside would be your skin. Now, if we do pass through this first line of defense, we move on to what's called the second line of defense. This also is non-specific, so there's no training involved. They're just anything foreign, they attack. These include specific types of cells, inflammation, and I say specific type of cells, it doesn't mean that it's protecting against specific types of pathogens. But it's different types of cells like phagocytes, macrophages, and neutrophils would be in that family, inflammation. And so we'll talk about some of these things. Now, these first 2 barriers, these first 2 lines of defense, these are non-specific. And they also call this part of your innate, meaning you're born with all this stuff. And the next line of defense, which would be your third line of defense, this is also called your adaptive, okay? And this is called adaptive because over time, your body learns how to fight diseases, okay? It learns over time. And it's very specific. And so you find that kids are sick quite often. And because of that, their body is learning the first time around to some of these pathogens. Now, this type of defense, this immune response, is going to be your B and your T lymphocytes, commonly called B and T cells, and they will be attacking specific targets and they will have memory. It's almost like when they encounter a bad guy, they take a Polaroid of it and put it in their back pocket or put it in their picture book. And so when that bad guy, when that pathogen comes back again, they have all the instructions to quickly attack it in a much faster way. All right, so you can see here we just went through your first line of defense. This is your surface barriers with chemicals. Second line of defense, it's internal, it's cells. It's also a chemical defense that would be inflammation. And then your third line of defense, this is going to be your B and your T lymphocytes. So let's talk about this in a little bit more detail. First line of defense, like we said, is the skin. The skin has a waterproof barrier. It has resistance to most toxins. It actually has a lower pH, and it has different types of antimicrobial enzymes that are found in like sweat in your oil glands that can protect it from invading organisms. Mucous membranes, this lines your respiratory tract and your mouth to anus. The mucus traps organisms, and then like in our respiratory tract, we have cilia, which are finger-like processes that beat upward, and it beats that mucus trap bacteria up to our throat, and then we can swallow it. Our digestive tract, it has a lot of enzymes, and in our digestive tract, like our stomach, has a high acidity that has some protection against pathogens. Chemical barriers that we have sweat and oil glands. They produce different types of antimicrobial chemicals that are in that, as I've said before. And then the lining of the stomach, as I said, the lining of the stomach is very acidic. Urine too as well. Urine basically moves fluid out of the body, so it flushes the microbes outside via urine. It also is somewhat acidic in nature. Usually it's about a pH of 4 to 6. Saliva and tears, these are also other fluids that contain lysozymes, and lysozymes are antimicrobial type of chemicals. So this is just a nice summary here of the first line of defense here. All right, your second line of defense, this is where we get into some cells. We're still non-specific, so anything foreign they attack. Phagocytes, these are white blood cells. We have a couple of them. The most predominant ones are neutrophils and macrophages. Neutrophils, these fight against bacteria. They're usually the first to the party. Macrophages, they're like the street cleaners at the end of a parade, and they're developed from a white blood cell called a monocyte. And they will sort of clean up cell debris and clean up any dead neutrophils. Eosinophils that tend to go after parasites, or you may see them in allergic reactions. Natural killer cells, these are also a type of white blood cells, and they are infamous for attacking cancer cells. In our second line of defense, we have a process called interferon. This is a really cool process. So when a cell becomes infected with a virus, it secretes these proteins called interferons. And these interferons, they interfere with viral replication in nearby cells, preventing the virus from coming into those cells. A lot of viruses don't have the machinery to survive, so they go into our cells, use our cells' machinery to reproduce and make more virus-infected cells. Interferons are released to neighboring cells, and they kind of say, hey guys, watch out. There's a virus nearby. Make sure your protein synthesis for your viral replication is shut down. Don't replicate any viruses. Another part of the second line of defense is the complement. And these type of proteins, they're floating around in our plasma. They're normally inactive, but when a pathogen comes into play, they sort of activate. And they can also work with the adaptive system, so with antibodies, and they destroy pathogens. They enhance phagocytosis. Phago means to eat. Cyte means the cell. Okay, so that means eating the pathogens. And they can also stimulate inflammation. So they're kind of an intermediate between our B lymphocytes, which we'll talk about in a little bit, which produce antibodies. All right, the hallmark of the second line of defense is inflammation. And there's 4 cardinal signs of inflammation: redness, heat, swelling, and pain. The redness and the heat, these are due to vasodilation. Okay, vasodilation means an increase in size in your blood vessels. And so when you have some sort of tissue injury and you have pathogens present, you're going to get an increased surge of blood flow to that area. And so vasodilation is opening up of your blood vessels. You're going to increase the permeability of those blood vessels. When I say increase the permeability, that basically means I just make those blood vessels a little bit more leaky. And the reason you want to make them more leaky is because you want them to basically send white blood cells, send macrophages that were once in the blood. You want to make sure they can actually leave the blood and get to those tissues where the pathogens or the tissue injury is. Also, you may need clotting proteins and other types of proteins found in the plasma. And so the capillaries, which are your smallest blood vessels where you do your exchange of your nutrients, this is where you would have your white blood cells leaving out of. Other proteins too that are found in the blood that may need to be involved in the healing process, you may need to let those out of the blood vessel too. So you kind of got to make these blood vessels more leaky. When you have swelling, you have pressure on nearby structures, and that can contribute to pain. But also cells can release pain-relieving chemicals too as well. There's a lot of chemicals that can send messages to the brain, and we can interpret that as pain. Okay, so this is just looking at some other terms right here to describe there. So you see blood flow increases to the area. All right, that is vasodilation. We also have mast cells. These are connective tissue cells that release histamine. Histamine is a chemical that causes vasodilation. Heat, temperature rises because of increased blood flow, the vasodilation. We've got swelling. So when the capillaries become leaky, fluid leaks out. Fluid brings clotting factors, oxygen, nutrients, and other types of cells. Pain can be caused by excess fluid. Prostaglandins, which are pro-inflammatory chemicals that I was talking about before, and even toxins from the bacteria can also stimulate pain. So you have a nice little video here showing those defense lines. This is an image here going through the redness, heat, swelling, and pain. You guys can read through that. All right, your second line of defense also includes what's called fever. And so what happens is that chemicals that are released called pyrogens, these are usually released from white blood cells. These are released to reset the brain's thermostat, so in the hypothalamus part of the brain, to a higher temperature. This helps basically when you get to this high temperature, the liver traps iron and zinc. And so a lot of toxins need those nutrients in order to survive. And so it sort of traps that, sequesters is the term, and prevents those toxins from having access with a higher temperature. Of course, a certain level is too high, so over 105 is very, very dangerous. Our third line of defense, which includes our adaptive immune system, this is specific. That's one thing to remember. Our first and our second line of defense was not specific. These are going to be organs of the lymphatic system are going to be big components of this. This includes like the thymus and the spleen, your tonsils. They recognize because it is specific, and they will destroy those specific pathogens or foreign molecules. Important characteristics, like I said, it has specificity and it has memory. So that was what I was talking about earlier with a polaroid. This is what allows us, our immune system, become stronger as we get older, is because it has memory. All right, we have little markers on our cells called MHC markers. They're called major histocompatibility complex markers. And this basically found on our own cell. It's kind of like little license plates on our cells that say, okay, we own these cells, they belong here. And they also are used by the cells to determine self versus non-self. Antigens, these are substances. We can either have self-antigens or foreign antigens. Here we're talking mostly about foreign antigens. These are little kind of molecules such as proteins or sugars or nucleic acids that would be found on the surface of the foreign molecule or the pathogen, and it allows us to recognize it as foreign. So it may be like triangles or stars or circles, and our B cells and our T cells, they actually went to school in our thymus and our bone marrow, and they went to school to kind of learn about these because remember we have specificity here. And so so they can recognize that via those surface. So you can see here just showing an antigen versus a self-MHC marker here. So I've been talking about these B cells and T cells here. They are white blood cells known as lymphocytes. B lymphocytes or B cells, they mature in your bone marrow. T cells, they mature in your thymus. Now, the T cells specifically will recognize those MHC self-markers. Looking at specificity here, okay, so antigens fit into receptors on those MHC receptors, and then the body targets that particular antigen, okay? The ones that do the attack are called effector cells, and the ones that remember that invader or that antigen is called memory cells, and they can make more effector cells if we encounter it at a later date. All right, so we have either antibody-mediated immune response or we have what's called cell-mediated immune response. Antibody-mediated immune response is due to the B cells. These B cells will differentiate. They change into plasma cells, and then the plasma cells will secrete antibodies. The antibodies, they sort of block the antigen. Here they use the term neutralize. And when I say the term neutralize, that means that antigen can't attach to anything else. A lot of foreign molecules, they need to use our cells in order to replicate or to make more virus-infected cells. So if you neutralize that antigen, you basically block it, you kind of break it down. That's done by antibodies. So they stop that antigen from attaching onto our normal cells. In the cell-mediated response, this is predominated by cytotoxic T cells. They basically inject holes into a cancer or infected cell, and they cause that infected cell to burst. Now, these recognize the MHC receptors. So when a cell becomes infected, it'll kind of like raise a red flag on its MHC receptor, and it says, hey, I've been infected. The cytotoxic T cell will recognize that MHC receptor and say, okay, that cell's infected, I need to destroy that cell. So cytotoxic T cells are very much involved in destroying those infected cells. There are some other T cells in here too. We have a suppressor T cell and we have helper T cells. Helper T cells, these ones are kind of an intermediate. It allows cytotoxic T cells to communicate between B cells. And suppressor T cells, these ones slow down your immune system. If your immune system is always hyped up, that would not be a good thing. And so this sort of suppresses it after you've fought off that pathogen. So we have some steps of the adaptive immune response. We have a threat, so a foreign organism or a molecule like an antigen enters the body. A macrophage, which is actually part of your second line of defense, will recognize that as foreign. It engulfs it, and it usually becomes a antigen presenting cell. And so I'm going to abbreviate that APZ. And an antigen presenting cell, it presents, so the macrophages present the antigens to your helper T cells. Your helper T cells, they are the communicators between your cytotoxic T cells and your B cells. So a macrophage will find a foreign pathogen floating around in your plasma. It'll gobble it up, and then it'll present it to a helper T cell and say, hey, look what I found. I found this thing with triangles on it. The helper T cell will say, okay, let me go alert the B cells. The B cells will make antibodies against that antigen, that triangle antigen, and the cytotoxic T cell will attack any cell that's been invaded by one of those triangles. So like I said, the helper T cells, they will alarm your B cells and your T cells, and they will eliminate that specific antigen from the body via their methods. B cells will form plasma cells that secrete antibodies which bind to those specific antigens. T cells will form cytotoxic T cells that attack any cell that's been affected by it. These B cells, and these T cells, they will replicate quite a bit. They will replicate in large amounts. And so to fight specifically against that triangle or whatever type of antigen is in the body. And so that's called clonal selection. Just think about making a clone. And so basically what this is saying, let's kind of repeat what we had said before. A macrophage finds an antigen circulating in the bloodstream. It presents it. It's an antigen presenting cell. It presents it to a helper T cell. Helper T cells, this is part of your third line of defense. It says, hey, I found this triangle out there. That helper T cell says, okay, I went to school in the thymus. I know what these are. I'm going to alert the B cells that know how to fight against triangles, and I'm going to alert the cytotoxic T cells that know how to fight against triangles. The helper T cell will alert those B cells and alert those specific cytotoxic T cells. And they'll say, okay, in order to fight against these triangle antigens out there, I need to make an army. And so they make clones of themselves. And so they can make sure, because they are traveling in the plasma, that they reach all parts of the body. Like I said, antibodies are secreted by plasma cells. Plasma cells are a derivative or a differentiation of a B cell. How do antibodies basically kill these things? How do they kill these antigens? They can do it by three methods. They can do it by what's called precipitation, lysis, attraction of phagocytes to eat them up, or neutralization. And so when you talk about precipitation, that kind of makes them all, the antigens stick together, and it's like an easier marking for death. It can cause them to burst, the antigens to lyse. It can cause attraction to phagocytes, which would eat them up. It would phagocytize them like macrophages. It can also cause neutralization. Neutralization is where they block the antigen's ability to bind to our cells, because remember, those antigens usually need our cells for replication. Cytotoxic T cells, they release perforins. Just think of perforating. They perforate holes in an infected cell. And once you poke a hole in a cell membrane, that cell membrane usually cannot recover from that. And so that cell will go through cell death. Okay, so our antibodies are also known as immunoglobulins. Immunoglobulins. There's 5 classes of these antibodies. They're circulating in the plasma portion of our blood. IgG is probably the most common one you would come in contact with. That is the most common antibody that's involved with fighting against a pathogen. IgE is another one that you may come in contact with. This one is involved in an allergic response. So this one attaches on to mast cells and basophils to cause the release of histamine. So you may see these circulating when someone's having that type of response, an allergic response. We have what's called a primary response, and we have what's called a secondary response. A primary response, think of like kids. This is like the first time when they come in contact with a pathogen. And you can see that looking here, this is the amount of antibody that's produced here. So you can see the first exposure We don't get a huge amount of antibody, and we take about 60 days to sort of fight it. But you can see the second response to that antigen, we have memory. So we pull out that Polaroid from our back pocket and we say, all right, I know how to fight this bad guy. And we get a very, very large antibody concentration the second time we encounter that same pathogen. And so depending on how we fight it, it may take a long time. But what the big thing is here is we get the faster response and more antibody concentration the second time we come in contact with this. As I had said before, our suppressor T cells need to turn off the immune response. If your immune cells keep going, you may basically start what's called an autoimmune disease. And so you want this immune system to sort of turn down. You don't want inflammation on all the time. We have what's called active immunity and we have what's called passive immunity. Active immunity is where you actually get the infection. So this is like, there's two forms. There's what's called naturally active, and then that's what's called artificially active. Naturally active, you actually get the infection, okay? So if you got coronavirus, you got the chicken pox. Artificially is when you get a vaccination form of it. And so you get a dead or a weakened, attenuated sort of pathogen. So it may stimulate a response, but it's not a huge response. And so that's what a vaccine is. So chickenpox vaccine, polio vaccine, hepatitis vaccine. And we are currently working on a vaccine for coronavirus too as well. And because you had the infection, you do produce memory cells with this. So you do produce antibodies. And sometimes we need a booster later in life. Passive immunity, they just give you the antibodies. You never got the pathogen. You never got the bug. When you have two types of here, you have naturally. This is when you pass from like mother baby, so during the womb or during breastfeeding. You also have what's called acquired. And acquired is when you have, artificial. This is where if you are going to like visit somewhere that has like malaria or yellow fever, you may get what's called prepared antibodies. They're very short-lived. These are called monoclonal antibodies. And so they're man-made antibodies, basically. And monoclonal antibodies are also used in research, diagnosis, disease treatment, and pregnancy tests. So a lot of different uses for prepared antibodies. A lot of autoimmune disorders it's basically where your body starts recognizing yourself as foreign. It can be organ specific, such as the thyroid gland or the pancreas with diabetes, or it can be non-organ specific, and you can have where you have overall lupus is a common where you have overall inflammatory events in many organs in the body. Allergies is the overreaction of immune system to an antigen, and it's usually an antigen that's most of the time harmless. So dog dander, fungi, pollen, dust mites. And some people have these overreactions to those allergens, and they're finding out that basically it's genetic. And a lot of it is genetic. With the allergic response there, usually you have a first exposure, and so allergens cause our plasma cells, which remember are from our B cells, to release an antibody called IgE. IgE binds to mast cells or basophils, and these will release the chemical called histamine. Histamine causes vasodilation, itchiness. So think about things like red eyes, itchiness, increased mucus production from the nose. And so we take antihistamines like Benadryl to stop those types of effects. Anaphylactic shock is an extreme reaction to an allergic reaction. These are people that sometimes are allergic to like peanuts or I'm trying to blank on another example, but they usually have epinephrine pens around them, EpiPens as they call them. And so you get this basic like extreme allergic reactions that causes pooling of blood in the capillaries, which makes breathing difficult, okay? And so you basically get bronchoconstriction and a hypotension, which is a drop in blood pressure. You give them an epinephrine pen, Okay, and when you give them an epinephrine pen, epinephrine is like an adrenaline response, and it shoots you up into bronchodilation, which opens your airways, and hypertension, which increases your heart rate. So, like I said, peanuts, bee stings. I forgot about bee stings. That's what I was thinking of. Shellfish. That's another example too, as well. Penicillin, amoxicillin. There's a whole family of that. And there's different types of treatments right here. Epinephrine, antihistamines, allergy shots. Allergy shots are quite common and are usually shown to be quite effective. All right, and that is it for the body defense mechanisms.